Hooray. Welcome, everyone, to Data-Driven Teaching, Making Every Moment Count, supporting multilingual learners and students with disabilities. We are here to learn and collaborate together. As we get going, if you could drop in the chat your name, your role, and the grade levels you support, as well as where you are in the state. And really thinking about kind of where we all are coming from. My name is Emily Green, and I work as an Ed Services Coordinator at the Glenn County Office of Ed and support primarily in the TK5 space up here in the North State. So I'll kick us off, and then feel free to add those to the chat. And this is our second session in really thinking about supporting learners with diverse learning needs. And so today we're going to be really looking at thinking about our multilingual learners and our students with disabilities. This is a part of the larger Project Arise offerings learning opportunities up and down the state for TK-12 educators, funded through the Reading Instruction and Intervention Grant from the California Department of Ed, and striving to elevate inclusive, effective reading instruction for every learner. And so this is out of that charge, one of the supports we are offering. And so we have several amazing partners across the state who are helping us to develop and deliver this professional learning. So County Office of Education hubs, as well as content partners, and you can see all of those listed across the screen. And collaboratively, they have shared their expertise and knowledge through one of the primary arms of this grant work, which is the free self-paced online courses offered by Project Arise, and really offer a comprehensive approach to literacy instruction and can be taken in any order to meet your needs, and have graduate semester units available for completion of those courses. And so you can see kind of the outline of the courses, as well as who was responsible for their development. And here is where you can find those on California Educators Together, a direct link to those. In addition to the courses, we have an array of other additional professional learning opportunities. And so these have been offered throughout this year. This is actually our final offering of the year. So we are so glad you are joining us. But there is an abundance of workshops and resources and aligned materials that have happened across the last 6 months or so. And all of those and the materials and resources and one-pagers and links that support the content presented, as well as the recordings of those sessions, will live on California Educators Together. And so there's a link in the chat that'll take you to an overview of all those offerings. But know that if you missed them, that you did not miss out, and that content will be available on California Educators Together. Turning to our session today, here is a resource for this particular session. And so if you click on the link there, it will force a copy, and then you will have your own resource, but a document to help guide your thinking and guide your reflection if you want to take notes in this format, if that is helpful for you. So that is there. You can grab it in the chat, and again, it'll make a forced copy that you can work with. And with that, I'm going to pass things off to Ruthie to take from here.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, let me quickly transition to sharing my screen. So I am Ruthie Woolfolk. I work with TNTP, and like Emily said, TNTP is one of the many partners supporting this work with Project Arise, both with the online modules and then with sessions and workshops like this one. And so really excited to be here today, and have been kind of facilitating through this series. And it's been just a great time to get to meet and kind of interact and engage with many teachers and district leaders in sessions like this. So we thank you so much for your engagement, and we're excited to dive in today. So with that, just want to give a quick overview in terms of the purpose of this series. This is really about kind of bringing together the research that you're learning throughout the coursework and then applying it with concrete strategies that can support equitable literacy access and outcomes for students with disabilities and multilingual learners specifically. But within all of these kind of strategies, they can support students in lots of ways that, students who might not be classified with disabilities, but might be struggling with literacy for other reasons or lots of reasons. So there's lots of ways that we're going to kind of talk today about how you can both monitor students in their literacy work and kind of provide some support and feedback for them so that they can continue to grow. So with that, we will have some objectives for today. One, just kind of living and leaning into our beliefs that all children can learn and are capable of achieving grade level standards with multiple opportunities and timely support and practice. Also, that we're kind of leaning into this, the importance of educators really understanding how to use data-driven assessment and literacy. So we're building knowledge today around what those assessments are, how you can use them to support instruction for all learners, but especially for learners who are multilingual learners or students with disabilities for today's focus. And then finally, we kind of always embed some sort of skill building in these sessions. Today, we're really going to emphasize how you can use data to, again, kind of support multilingual learners or students with disabilities in your classroom, and how both like the collection of that data and then how to respond to that data once you have it. So that's where we're going to kind of work today. I'll give you a moment to review the agenda for our session to yourself. All right, so we're going to first start with just an overview of different types of assessments and the purpose that they serve within your learning cycles. So, when we know kind of the end goal and what is expected on a summative assessment, our instruction and our interim assessments and our formative assessments should be kind of building toward that goal. And using data and seeing what students can do kind of along the way helps mitigate against having like a really big surprise at the end, or having that moment where you're like, oh, I really did not anticipate that they were confused about that, or this didn't go as well as I thought. So we're going to especially lean into the types of assessments that can support you in building up to that summative assessment so that you don't have that kind of experience. First, we're going to kind of start with just a broad overview of all of the different types of assessments that you might have access to data around. So you can see at the top of this visual reference to universal screeners, which likely are pretty familiar to you. We're not going to focus so much on those today, but it is important to just kind of know that universal screeners require all students to be annually screened for potential reading difficulties. And these are kind of what they sound like. They're screeners against really research aligned indicators of where, if students are kind of falling below specific research aligned cut scores, then there might need to be an appropriate follow-up and instructional response to make sure that we're supporting students in the right ways. And so these start with really early grades and assess things like letters, letter sounds, syllabus in Spanish, depending on the language that you're using those assessments for. They assess fluency and things like that, depending on where you are in the grade level bands. The assessments that we're going to focus on today primarily are formative assessments. So I'm going to give an overview of what those are, and then I'll talk through the other two pieces before we move into our formative assessment work. So formative assessments are really the most frequent assessment types that you're going to be using. In many cases, these are also the types that you have the most control over. So these are given at various points throughout the year. These can even be given and should be kind of given on the daily, where you're really kind of measuring in a very ongoing way how students are doing against very specific expectations. So what did I want students to get from this lesson today? How did that go? And kind of keeping track of really kind of in the moment data about students. The impact of this is it allows you as a teacher to kind of promptly adjust instruction. You can kind of do something immediately, you can do something within the next couple of days to really respond to what you're seeing with student outcomes. And this can help maximize student learning. It can maximize student engagement and motivation with their learning because they're kind of experiencing that building and that success or feedback really quickly. The second type of assessment that we often see referenced is what is called interim assessments. And these are given in a much less frequent way than formative assessments. They're kind of various checkpoints, often like 2 to 4 times a year, depending on the type of assessment that you're talking about. The purpose of these assessments is really kind of to make predictions about how students might perform on the summative assessment ultimately. So these kind of are intended to monitor learning across a broader spectrum or span of expectations and learning than you would with the really specific formative assessment information. And the impact of that is more about facilitating a teacher or even a grade level or school to identify some trends in student learning or expectations. So we can kind of see in a more ongoing way, is there change over time, or are students growing kind of from beginning of the year to middle of the year, or is there some stagnation or even some kind of decrease in their performance? And so that can help, again, allow for really timely interventions. It can also ensure a more ongoing progress toward much larger learning goals than the formative assessments. The last type of assessment that we often see referenced in literacy work is summative assessment. So the most common version of these that you'll kind of see reference or think about is state testing, where we're really kind of assessing students on a broad kind of span of student grade level expectations. And within a literacy unit, we might even see summative assessments at the end of a unit where we're kind of assessing or having students write something about many texts that they have read throughout that unit. So we're kind of getting much broader, again, in comparison to the formative assessments. We're providing and getting some really concrete information in a more long-term way about how students are performing against grade level expectations. And the impact of these can be that it provides students with a solid sense of accomplishment about like how they're performing against grade level expectations or how maybe they've grown since their previous grade level. It also gives a lot of information for educators and lots of key stakeholders in the school or district about the efficacy of instructional practice and curriculum alignment. And so decisions at a larger scale can usually be facilitated and kind of made with summative assessment work. So today, like I said, we're really going to focus on formative assessments, and we're really going to zoom in on literacy assessments within that category. So in the chat, I'd love to see, just on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar are you with Scarborough's reading rope, which you see on the screen here? So I'll give you a moment. 1 being like really not familiar at all. This might be the first time you're seeing it. 5 being I've heard about this over and over and I'm very familiar with kind of the concepts and ideas behind it. Okay, so seeing some 5s. So lots of familiarity with this image. Great. So you kind of know from this graphic that we do have 2 kind of strands of literacy work that we might be capturing data around and assessing around. So the language comprehension side of the rope, which you see represented at the top, and then the word recognition side of the rope, which you see represented at the bottom. I also included in this graphic from the Spanish reading tapestry some kind of just reminders for particularly for multilingual learners, and we'll talk about this a little bit later today, about the importance of facilitating and supporting students to make cross-linguistic connections and facilitate translanguaging for them. We're also going to talk today about it's the importance of in assessments knowing how a home language might differ from the language of instruction, and also knowing what assets students are bringing from their home language to kind of make those cross-linguistic connections or to support translanguaging, and not kind of operating with the assumption that students aren't bringing knowledge from their own home language about literacy or about kind of concepts of the world that you might be building language around. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in this session, but I did put it on this slide to just kind of give us a keep that top of mind about multilingual learners, that we always want to be operating with that asset-based thinking in mind. So thinking about the types of reading assessments, that is one thing that we do want to be really specific around of like, are we actually trying to capture data for language comprehension information, or are we trying to capture information about word recognition skills and how students are doing with mastering those skills? The more specific we can be about which kind of side of this rope image that we're talking about, one, the types of assessments that we use will differ and the functions of those assessments will differ, but it also impacts kind of how we respond to that data, how we might diagnose specific reading gaps, how we might respond to support students in making progress in those things. And so I want to just emphasize, before we even get down the path of assessments, really being specific to yourself of what information am I trying to get about student data? And that might inform, literally before you even get started, what types of assessments you use. So we'll talk first about this language comprehension side of the rope and some examples of types of assessments that you could use to get information about knowledge-based competencies from students. These are not all of the types of assessments that you can use, but these are really commonly used summative assessment types especially. So when we think about collecting data on knowledge-based competencies, one important consideration that we want to think about is how familiar the text will be for students before they are prompted to do something with it. So you can see in this graphic, we have this type column in the middle where it kind of explains and lays out, is this something that's like a hot text or something that's super familiar for students, or is this a cold text where students have actually never read this text before? We want to kind of have some variety actually in language comprehension assessments where students are experiencing some opportunities to write or answer questions about a text that they've read before or a topic that they are experiencing in a unit, so that they have some familiarity and we can get some really clear information about their level of depth with grade level standards aligned questions and tasks, their level of kind of processing about different text types and topics. But we also want to have some opportunities for students to experience an unknown text or topic and answer some questions about that. It really does give us some different information and some helpful information about how students are becoming more strategic with their reading processing skills. And so over time, we do want them to be able to kind of process any type of text or genre or topic and start to make sense of that text more and more independently as their schooling goes on. So kind of outlining this graphic with assessment types, we'll start at the top. The end of unit writing task, again, kind of is within a curriculum embedded unit where we've read several texts about a specific topic, where we've read a set of texts that are kind of organized around some kind of essential question. And so kids have done all of this thinking and talking about these texts and this topic throughout the unit. And the end of unit writing task allows them to kind of demonstrate their understanding of that text or of those sets of texts or that topic by kind of explaining an argument or giving some information or explaining some of the ideas that they have explored throughout that unit. So for example, a sixth grade writing task in this category might ask students to cite multiple sources from the unit and write an informational essay that answers the unit essential question. So we're kind of allowing students to process and regurgitate some of the text that they've read throughout in a way that they're synthesizing and analyzing those texts independently. And we're able to get some really helpful information about, again, those reading comprehension standards, certainly the writing standards, and some language standards and just sort of conventions around organizing and kind of having coherence in their writing tasks. The reading comprehension test that might again come at the end of a unit is also a curriculum embedded assessment, but it has a slightly different application where the topics can be familiar and are connected to the unit that you might be exploring. So we might be kind of doing a whole unit around animal habitats, but we might have students read a text that they haven't actually read before. So animal habitats is kind of a familiar enough topic, but we give them a top or a text about a slightly different animal than they've read before or a different habitat than they've read before, and then they can answer some questions about that. I will really emphasize in that example, we wouldn't use the results from that reading comprehension assessment to isolate specific standards within comprehension and say like, oh, we need to work on main idea or we need to work on cause and effect. Reading comprehension assessments don't really function that way in terms of being able to specifically say, why did a student answer this incorrectly? Because there might be lots of reasons that could be getting in the way, including vocabulary, including kind of having difficulty processing cause and effect or main idea. But it's really challenging to pinpoint a specific kind of standard that you might need to work on. So these will give us kind of broad comprehension information and kind of, again, give information about how students are processing a text that's unfamiliar and their ability to answer questions about that. But we wouldn't want to kind of use those in an unhelpful way in terms of analyzing the data. And then the final type of knowledge-based competency that you might see are kind of, again, with cold text or topics. And these often come with diagnostics or interim assessments, or even with like things like the Smarter Balanced assessment, where students are reading a completely brand new text and are answering questions about those. Sometimes they may include writing tasks. Sometimes they may include kind of short answer or multiple choice. And again, this doesn't really tell us which specific standard might be breaking down if students answer something incorrectly, but it does give us helpful information about how students access text broadly and do especially gives them helpful information of like, is informational text or fictional text kind of more successful or less successful for students. So those are the types of assessments that might support knowledge-based information. The other type of assessment for skill-based competencies are where we're really going to lean in today and kind of focus, especially when we talk about ways that we can respond to some of the data or ways that we can support students who might be struggling with reading. So skill-based competencies refer to things that are targeting reading foundational skills, so that word recognition part of the rote. And like I said, these can target lots of different types of data points in terms of like phoneme segmentation, fluency, syllabus in Spanish, depending on which language you're assessing in and which grade level that students are entering the test window for. So step one is kind of doing that universal screener. And then if students are identified as at risk in some way, step two is really about trying to determine specific individual needs. And this will usually come with a separate kind of diagnostic assessment that can get much more specific about which types of phoneme segmentation skills students might need support with, which letter sounds students might need support with, so on. Then steps 3 through 5 is kind of where you respond to that data. So one thing that's vital in those steps 3 through 5 is to make sure that you're still using, especially curriculum embedded assessments are incredibly helpful for this. Some type of very frequent, so weekly is usually kind of where curriculum embedded assessments are designed around. Some type of pretty frequent assessment structure where you're able to see where are students making progress with these skills. And importantly, and this is why I emphasize the curriculum embedded piece, you can also match and align that with what has actually been taught in instruction, and how is that supporting students in making progress. So, if we're assessing students on something that hasn't been taught yet, it's hard to make decisions around that. So ideally, these are like weekly data points that you can kind of capture. How are they doing? Where might they need support after this? I want to highlight, for supporting multilingual learners, an incredible resource from the San Diego County Office of Education. This is actually in the Project Arise course as well, but they have this really great quote, which is in this blue box at the bottom of the screen, about the importance of all of the types of assessments that we talked about so far being administered in home languages and English to help really capture accurate data of what students know and what they can do across languages. This really helps us, one, emphasize that the language of instruction and assessment matters to really understand where students are coming in with. And you can see on the left side of the screen the full Spanish reading tapestry. So the cross-linguistic connections and the translanguaging piece of that we just talked about. But this reminds us, like, kids are bringing lots of assets into the classroom and lots of linguistic assets, importantly. And so a key part of our data analysis for multilingual learners and for supporting those students is, one, honoring that and really kind of approaching their instruction in that asset-based mindset. And two, thinking about, what do we know about these students? What information do we still need? And especially in relation to the target language of instruction, where we are trying to support those cross linguistic connections, we really need to get as much information as we can about what students are bringing in from the home language assets that can support making those connections. So I just wanted to, one, highlight that resource, but also kind of just emphasize having a broad set of information about all of our students, but in particular, multilingual learners and their linguistic assets. Finally, we're going to think about, what do we do with the information once we have that data? So we have like all of this assessment data, we have all of these types of assessments. What you do with that assessment information really depends on your role. So this table will outline on the left side in that light blue color for teachers, if you're in the classroom and you're using that assessment data and you're coming to this workshop to try to get information about, how do I support students with all of the data I have? You can kind of see on this chart, this is really about making instructional decisions in both an ongoing day-to-day way and a more long-term way. So, guiding daily instruction, adjusting core instruction, determining instructional needs. That's kind of all within like your ongoing progress monitoring and support structure. As a teacher, you're kind of constantly thinking about, what are students making progress with? How can I continue to support? What's working? What do I need to adjust? So on. On the right side of the screen, in that sort of darker blue color, is if you're coming to this workshop as a school or district or county leader or another educational role, you might be thinking about data in a different way. So you might be thinking more kind of at the systems level, where you're thinking about, how are we tracking progress across subgroups or across a group of students or even grade levels? How, are we supporting continuous improvement at the system level? How are we defining or refining literacy programs? How are we thinking about core instruction? How are we thinking about support structures like intervention and how those things connect? So that it just functions differently, where you might be thinking more at the system level and making sure that teachers have the conditions that they need to make all of the daily decisions that are outlined on the left, and that they have the support that they need to make those decisions. So one final note before I give you some time to reflect on your own is, anytime we have data, whether qualitative or quantitative data, whether formative or summative assessment data, that is really one part of a student's story. It's not the only thing we know about those students. And so that sometimes can get lost, especially when we talk in like data conversations where it's like, these are my low students, these are my high students. And so we really want to emphasize again this kind of asset based thinking about students. And I find that these pieces on the screen, especially the bolded questions that you can ask yourself, can really help kind of give some best practices to think about in this work. So, in terms of supporting students, particularly students with disabilities or multilingual learners, really coming to the conversation and coming to the data work with thinking about what do they already know? What can they already do? What do they still need? Um, or what supports might they need, and not just coming to the conversation of like eligibility or placement, or thinking about them kind of putting them in a tier or a group or kind of a box. The other kind of best practice that I tend to think about is, are there structures, particularly for the school district or county leaders that have come to this workshop, are there structures that enable regular collaboration across roles? So getting the multilingual learner supports in your building or in your district connected to the general education supports, special education supports. Are they allowed, or, are there conditions that allow them to collaborate with general education services, so on and so forth? So really thinking about, are there times for that connection? And then finally, do educators guide reflection on lessons or units with attention to, how are my students with disabilities experiencing instruction? How are my students who are multilingual learners experiencing instruction? And what else, might they need adjusted or enhanced to really make sure that they're accessing the types of instruction that we're working on. So with that, I'll give you a moment for some reflection and processing. So just give you a second to kind of think independently. You can do this in the handout, or you can use whatever system kind of works for you in terms of sharing, or just kind of thinking to yourself about what in this section affirmed work that you've already done, and if there's anything new or different that you want to add to your practice after today. Assessments. First, we're going to define a little bit more specifically what is a formative assessment. So, like we talked about before, a formative assessment is any kind of process that's conducted during instruction that gives you feedback that enables you to make adjustments or to improve some kind of student performance. So, the thing I really want to stamp about this is, one, this second bullet point that you see here is, it's typically not graded, or if it is graded, it doesn't have a significant point value for students in terms of like their overall grade. This is just an ongoing kind of highly visible way that we can just collect quick data. And the other thing I really want to stamp is, you want to think about this as kind of a lesson level assessment. So getting very, very specific about the objective for the day, the learning target for the day, and thinking to yourself, what do I need to know about if students got that objective or got that learning target, so that I can make decisions for tomorrow, so that I can make decisions kind of for the next few days. So this is like a really immediate set of feedback that you're trying to get in the moment from students. So examples might be exit tickets, even class discussions can give you a lot of formative assessment information. Engagement strategies like thumbs up if you agree, thumbs up if you don't agree, that can give you some information about where students are kind of processing. Whiteboards are great, quick kind of show me your response, things like that. Or even like gallery walks or full class polls, depending on the grade level you teach, that might be more logistically feasible in some grade levels than others. And so thinking of this as like a really quick bite-sized assessment that gets to the key point of today's lesson, that will give you some information to kind of check in. If you are a district, school, or county leader on this call, you should be able to check in with teachers about their formative assessment data. So you should be able to quickly say like, oh, what did the exit ticket today look like? Or, what was your formative assessment data? What was the like key question that you were using for assessment. So this might be something in your practice that you want to add in of just kind of like checking in from time to time about are teachers doing that formative assessment and how are kids performing on those things. In terms of why these matter so much, so why would you add that to your practice? According to research, these can really improve student achievement, but they can also really improve student motivation and engagement and just kind of positive attitude about how they're doing in class because they're getting, importantly, some type of feedback from the teachers. And this also just helps students kind of understand and demonstrate their level of understanding of how like learning is progressing, how did I do today on the exit ticket, things like that. It also can help particularly struggling students kind of perform better in terms of kind of having that quick bite-sized moment to demonstrate their understanding. And because they're getting that feedback and because teachers are adjusting instruction to it, you might see students who are struggling actually start to improve their performance across a unit because you're really closely monitoring what do they need, how did that go, where do they need some more support, etc. And the most important kind of thing I want to emphasize about why it's so important to do daily formative assessments is this is about giving you the information you need to determine what might need to be retaught. Are we actually ready to accelerate in some ways? Are things going faster than I thought they would? Are kids really like interested in fairy tales? So this fairy tale unit is going really quickly, things like that. And so this graphic on the right side of the screen kind of outlines these questions that you just kind of can constantly be percolating around of like, where are we going? Where are we right now? How do I close the gap between those two pieces? It also can allow students to reflect on those things if you make those kind of concepts really visible for kids. This is our essential question. Here's what we're working on. Where are we right now? How are you doing on those things? So again, that can just increase motivation, engagement, and just confidence in kind of literacy ability. So these are a couple of examples of types of formative assessments that you might use in literacy work. These are included in your handout as well, but this is an example from a lesson from CKLA. It actually does come from the unit in second grade where kids read fairy tales and tall tales. And so you can see from kind of the screenshots on the screen, this is part 2 of a fairy tale where kids are reading Beauty and the Beast. So they've read part 1 and then part 2 comes the next day. And so there's some kind of opportunity for students to retell part 1 and remember what they've kind of read so far. And then they read the text and answer the comprehension questions that you see in sort of the middle of the screen. So thinking about, especially these core objectives on the left side of the screen, where kids are intended to be within this lesson describing the characters, describing the plot, describing the setting of Beauty and the Beast. Within this set of questions, where do you see some examples of formative assessments that might give the teacher some information about how students are doing connected to those core content objectives? So I'll give you a moment to kind of share those in the chat, and then we'll look at where we could go as well with this example. So where do you see some examples of formative assessments? Yeah, and I guess like get really specific here of like which questions and what information might they give a teacher. the specific characters. What else? Yeah, so looking at like what lessons did this story convey? So looking at this set of questions, particularly as y'all said, like the retelling will give us some information about just whether or not from part one, kids can describe the plot, can describe this characters and setting from part one of the story. And then thinking about in today's lesson when they've read a new section of the text, um, there are some specific kind of addition to that character analysis and to the plot work where we're thinking about like how does the beast reassure Beauty that he is not as fearsome as he thinks. So there's some like, oh, there has been some sort of challenge or conflict in the story and some resolution. Why does that request, or what request does the beast grant after she decides to stay with him at the palace? Why does this request make a sorrowful look come over Beauty's face? So starting to think about how, again, there's challenges, there's character reactions to those challenges. Even thinking about in question number two, so who is the royal character in this fairy tale? Give some information of our students kind of learning about the genre of fairy tale in general. There are often royal characters in this genre, and kids have kind of processed that throughout this unit. And so this will be another opportunity for kids to build that vocabulary and kind of cement those story elements that are specific to this genre. But something that you might be thinking is these might kind of give us some helpful formative assessment information, but students might still need some additional supports or scaffolds to successfully access these questions or to respond to them in a way that gives us helpful information. And so you might make some decisions to adapt these questions slightly, where the question doesn't change, but the supports that you give students to respond to those questions might change. So on the screen here, you see some examples in question number 4, where we provided some supports. So what request does the beast grant or give Beauty after she decides to stay with him at his palace? At the very bottom of the screen, you see one option that we might give students is, or one support is using a cognate in their home language to kind of have that cross-linguistic connection and kind of give them a specific visual reference of here's what a palace is in Spanish, that's El Palacio. Here's a picture of that. So when when she decides to stay with him at the palace, they can kind of visualize what that looks like before they're responding to the question. Additionally, we might give a sentence frame for students to respond. So the beast tells the Beauty she can blank, and we might even give some specific words or phrases that they could use within that sentence frame. We might give a variety of sentence frames, or some might be sentence starters, or some might be kind of more robust support sentence frames where kids are filling in a little bit less and a little bit less of an open-ended way. The other thing that we could do is within the actual text itself, we might embed some of this questioning so that kids have some processing time before they get to the end of the lesson to actually like think about this idea, think about this challenge, or this resolution or request. And so we might even engage students in some additional scaffolding questions within the text itself. So you can see these on the screen here in blue, where we might ask questions like, what do you notice about the way Beauty looks in this image? Let's take a big sigh together like the bee, so kids can kind of feel, oh, like this is how he feels right now. How do you feel when you sigh? Even, unpacking some specific phrases in the text of what does very well mean. And if needed, we could even provide some students with kind of a student-friendly definition of like, you might think of very well as a really positive thing, but when we're sighing and saying that, it's actually like you're not feeling great about this. And so kind of helping kids just unpack within the text itself what is happening in this section before you get to the end of the lesson and you ask this question and you're like, kids were really confused about this request. You can kind of mitigate some of those things along the way. And that might give you some formative assessment information in itself. So, a couple of things that we'll then talk about is how to kind of make instructional decisions using that data. So, with that scaffolding example that we just looked at, scaffolding is often the first thing that comes to mind when we think about using data. It's like, oh, like kids need support, so I'm going to provide scaffolds. And it's important that we're aligned on kind of the definition of this term. So we think of instructional scaffolding as both a noun, so something we might give for students like a graphic organizer or a sentence frame or word or phrase bank that we like just talked about on the screen. It also can be a verb. So it could be things that we do to support students, like embedding questions throughout the text before they get to the end of the lesson, embedding Spanish cognates within the lesson so that kids have that and some picture support for vocabulary, things like that. So with this definition, the intentional practice of attending to content, students, and other contextual factors in the design or implementation of, this is really important, temporary, student-specific instructional supports that maximize access to grade level concepts and tasks. So that idea of, we didn't change the question in the Beauty and the Beast example. We kept the question the same. Kids are getting access to the same grade level questions that all students are getting access to. But we have some student specific supports that we could make some instructional decisions around. And the importance of temporary is like, we might not be doing that sentence frame or that embedded set of questioning within the text for every lesson, but we might have decided in Beauty and the Beast today, this sentence frame will really help students access responding to that question. Today, it's going to be really critical in this section of the text that I pause and kind of give some processing time for students to think through what's happening in this part of the story and to do some specific vocabulary or phrase level support so that they can really understand what's going on before we answer this question. So I really want to emphasize that rather than asking, what is a good scaffold for this lesson? Or how do I scaffold this curriculum? Instead, we want to ask ourselves really targeted questions that get at the nuance of what we might need to consider about the content that we're trying to deliver, about what we know about our students and what assets they're bringing into the lesson from their home language, from their knowledge base, and from just the context that we have. So there might be some contextual considerations of like, what is feasible in this lesson in terms of time constraints or in terms of even like material support that we might need to just make some adjustments in terms of the type of scaffolds that we're using. So I want to just double down on this idea that effective scaffolds are not just kind of things that we put in front of students. It in a literacy class might look like in text complexity and vocabulary, supporting students with how we read the text. So we could adjust if we're doing read aloud or paired reading, using rereading to help students build independence and just kind of the vocabulary repetition across the set of lessons. We might really emphasize explicit and implicit vocabulary support or chunk the text in specific ways. It might look like in questioning, having a focus question and then using some strategic sequenced questions to scaffold students up to that focus question. Or it might be some discussion process strategies. So providing lots and lots of opportunities for students to process and share their thinking in pairs, in small groups, in the whole group, having some variety in terms of verbal response and written response so that kids are getting an opportunity to rehearse something orally, but they are demonstrating their understanding through writing ultimately. So these aren't just like, again, we don't want to be just thinking like, what scaffolds can I use today? But we might apply these scaffolds for language support or for supporting struggling readers in really temporary and intentional ways to make sure they have access to grade level work. I'm going to introduce a resource that can help you use data to really inform what scaffolds that you're using. So one structure that we really find effective is student work analysis. So using student work analysis, especially in language comprehension, to kind of continue the through line of the Beauty and the Beast example that we talked about, is an opportunity for you to think through what is the task that students are being asked to do, and then using some previous writing to think through, did they get it? Not yet. What kind of ways did students demonstrate understanding? What trends are you noticing across different student writing? What does that mean for your next step? So I really want to emphasize again, it's not just about like selecting from a menu of scaffolds, it's really understanding your students and understanding what assets are they bringing into this lesson, what supports might they need. So I'm going to show you a little bit closer with the student work analysis structures, some types of questions that you might consider or ask yourself in this process, and then I'll give you a moment to kind of reflect on the ways that this can support you. So using in the language comprehension side of things, a writing task from a previous lesson. Again, this doesn't have to be a really formal writing task. It can be very quick, write, kind of formative assessment, daily exit ticket kind of information. And selecting from that a sample, I usually like to use 3 students from a class set just to get a representative sample and look at what was the task, what was the target language of the lesson, is there evidence of this from student responses or from the conversation? What happened in this lesson that might have led to bright spots or areas for growth? And were students able to access the language of the task? What supports helped them produce the target language? So, looking at like, did we provide sentence frames? Did that support students in accessing the actual task? Did we not provide sentence frame? Might that be something we need to consider? I also really appreciate at the bottom of this example, this community building stuff, where we think about how did students respond to something that was challenging today? Or how did you as a teacher respond to something that was challenging in your teaching today? How did your feelings or mood kind of impact the classroom if they did? Which students and families should you connect with before class tomorrow? And were the language supports enough for all students to access the content? If not, what might need to be adjusted or added tomorrow? Similarly, on the foundational skill side, you can kind of think through those same questions, but we might be thinking obviously about different skills. And so in foundational skills, we might be getting very specific about what skills were targeted. Is there a relationship between those skills and the home language and the target language of instruction? And again, sort of what happened in the lesson that led to bright spots or challenges in that work. So thinking through those, I'll just give you a quick minute to reflect on what information would this give you to support your students, and what questions specifically support multilingual learners or students with disabilities in your setting, and why might that matter in your work to either add this to your practice or to affirm things that you're already doing. analysis, especially when we show templates like this one, is like, how will I have time to do this, or how long does this actually take? And I will say the first time, especially that people do it, it can take longer. So I've, engaged with PLC work with these types of assessment analysis structures where it can take like the whole PLC block, or it can take up to 45 minutes. But as people get into this routine of just like quickly looking at 3 student samples from their class set and getting into this routine of like went well, what were the bright spots, what were the challenges, and just kind of get into that rhythm. I've seen it take less than 5 minutes for people to do this type of analysis. Or, obviously people can get much deeper and it can take up to 20 minutes if they're getting like really in the weeds about the whole class set or something like that. So I would just emphasize you will have to start slow and build this routine, but it can be a very, very quick routine, almost like a do now in PLC work, where before you get started in thinking about next week's lessons or tomorrow's lessons, you're kind of thinking like, what happened yesterday? What are some quick kind of brief discussion points that we can make about our student data? And that just kind of keeps that information top of mind so that you can build into the actual PLC collaboration. So it does take a little bit of time on the front end, but you start to get faster. Yeah, Melissa.
Ruthie, thank you so much. I'm thinking about the secondary teams that I've supported and just some of the questions that might be coming up, particularly are for dually identified students, and we get into those tricky spaces around reading comprehension, particularly, and lexiles being so broad in the classroom, as well as writing being a challenge to demonstrating. So I'm just curious how you've walked either individual teachers or like PLCs around some of those things that they might want to bring up first as barriers to being able to teach.
Yeah, I think sometimes when I do this, a response honestly that I get is people are really surprised by what kids actually can do when they really like are forced to kind of look at this in this structured way where it's like, what can students do? That's one of the first questions. And often I think sometimes, especially with writing, teachers can get really fixated on mechanic mistakes or grammar mistakes or like spelling or capitalization or things like that. And they kind of lose sight of what students are demonstrating in terms of content or comprehension knowledge. And so sometimes I find it helpful and effective to name for teachers at the beginning. Like I actually like there might be grammar things that we need to work on. There might be capitalization mistakes or spelling mistakes that we do like we want kids to be producing grade level work ultimately. Like we will address those and we should address those. And, we want to know that those things are happening. But in this conversation, I want you to really focus on what kids are demonstrating in terms of their comprehension and their content understanding from this lesson. So I know the Beauty of the Beast example was a second grade example, so not exactly the type of thing that you're thinking about, but you can apply that all the way up to high school. That idea of like, if our content objective is something about a specific genre, so in high school, it might be memoir versus fairy tales in second grade. But there are specific things about memoir that we want kids to be demonstrating some knowledge about. And so, what are they showing us in this writing about that? Versus like, are there spelling mistakes? So I think that's one barrier that can kind of help break down just the immediate teacher response of like, they're behind. And then the other thing I find helpful in this work is if teachers are bringing, especially if they have curriculum, if they're bringing tasks that are common across the grade level, where it's like we're all agreeing that we're going to bring this exit ticket together and look at it. Sometimes there's a level of, like, I don't know if peer pressure is the right word, but there's a level of like when you start to sit side by side and you see, like, oh, your students wrote paragraphs and had really independent writing and deep thinking, and like all of theirs were different. And it's very clear they did it demonstrating their own thinking. And my class all has the same exact response. And we did it in a very structured way. And so kids more or less were like copying something, or they didn't really write that much and maybe I didn't provide them enough support. That might not be said out loud, but there is that wheel turning process that can happen where teachers start to think about like, oh, what support did you provide to get that level of response? What might I need to adjust to make sure that my students have that? And so that's where the key idea of really this is about grade level content and access. So we're not changing the question, but we might be changing the support. And so if they're bringing something common, I find that can be helpful to kind of break down some of those barriers. So hopefully that's a helpful kind of way to get started to answer your question. But it does take time. I will say that it's not like an overnight, oh, people are like, wow, like this is amazing. And like, I can't believe we never did this. It is a routine that you have to build. Okay, really quickly, I do want to emphasize the other angle that we want to think about, both with student work analysis and just looking at student work in general, is we want to be giving students feedback as well, particularly for multilingual learners and students with disabilities. We want to really be thinking about the types of feedback that we're giving and if they are helpful in giving students something specific and corrective to do differently, or if we're just giving them advice that's not really actionable or something that's evaluative, like good job or like nice work. So this comes from Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And she talks about in that work, student feedback should really function to affirm success and intervene when students are struggling, to lift the quality of student work and increase the level of mastery ultimately, to increase the efficacy of student practice, and to collect and use data. And so these kind of characteristics of types of feedback that we might use are things I think that are just helpful reflections to think about. Like, are we giving kids advice that's not really actionable? Like, you might need more examples in your report, but not actually telling them how to do that, what to do, like how to improve their writing. Or are we giving them, again, this like evaluative, just like general, nice presentation, but not really telling them why it was successful? So I would just encourage you in your feedback reflection, one, to think about like, am I actually giving kids feedback about their work, or am I just looking at their formative assessments and never telling them how it went? That would be the first step I would think about. The second step I would think about is, what's the quality of that feedback? So is it actually instructive and corrective? And that means, is it focusing on correcting an aspect of the student's performance and giving them an actionable thing that they can actually do to improve? This also helps build trust for kids of like, oh, my teacher is on my side. She really wants me to do well. And this also helps you get really specific of like, what is the right level of corrective information that will help the student improve. So we can't give them 17 things to improve on. We want to get really specific and give them one or two things so we're not overwhelming them. But this helps us be really timely and like, what can you do immediately to help you get better? So in the third sentence, you use the wrong punctuation and have a run-on sentence. Melissa, this gets back to that grammar piece. We can address mechanics and we should, but we want to get very granular and specific and timely about giving that feedback and not just look at writing later and be like, well, now they're behind. So the more we can kind of give that corrective feedback in the moment, the more kids can kind of correct that and apply it to their next learning or next task. And the other thing that's helpful about that is it kind of gives kids feedback in a really low stress, supportive way, and not just like, oh, you did this summative assessment, it didn't go well. That can trigger a lot of anxiety. And so this can be kind of thought through as like, day to day, how am I providing support of like, let's use the right punctuation so that this isn't a run-on sentence. So can you correct that and then think about that next time? I will say, especially for students with disabilities and multilingual learners, this matters a lot. And sometimes we find, just like historically and in our observations, kids tend to get this category of like evaluative but not instructive feedback, where kids are just getting like, nice work, good job, you're really smart, you worked really hard. And providing that level of specificity can be a way to provide equity to all students, where we're getting very granular and specific for that student. What do you need to improve or correct? Or sometimes it's affirming them of like, you did this really well, but getting very clear for them about what they can replicate in future efforts that helps them be successful. So not just saying like, nice presentation, without getting very specific about why it was successful. So we're going to take a moment and watch a quick video of a student during a dictation activity. And what I want you to think about in the video is, what data did the teacher collect in that lesson and what feedback was provided? The other piece I want you to think about is what considerations you think the teacher made when choosing how to support diverse learners. So we're going to switch to this. I want to make sure. Yes, okay, I'm on the right screen.
So, Noah, what letter do I need to put for?
C.
C. Kiss your brain.
The kindergartners in Ashton Smith's class recently learned that there are 3 ways to spell the k sound, with a C, a K, or CK. Often students will mix these up as they experiment with these patterns and learn how they work. Let's watch how Miss Smith handles one of these expected mix-ups.
This word is going to be really tricky, so you're going to have to make 2 decisions for your k sound, okay? So listen to your vowel and listen to where your k sound is. Tappers up. Your word is kick.
Kick.
Let's tap it. Kick.
Miss Smith and paraprofessional Diamond Jones circle the room as they check the students' work, either reinforcing the correct spelling or offering corrective feedback, giving their students the chance to learn from their mistakes.
Good job, Tran. Okay, Noah, I have a question. Can we use CK at the beginning of a word?
Yeah, wait, you're at the end.
At the end. So not CK, what would we put here?
T.
What's your vowel sound?
What? Wait. K.
Very good.
This wasn't a random mistake, but a logical one. Noah did spell the k sound, just with the wrong letters for this situation. Miss Smith gave Noah the feedback and time he needed to figure out the right letter. She's created an environment of trust where learning grows from mistakes. With Noah's permission, she's going to share this teachable moment with the whole class.
Noah wrote C-K-I-C-K. But we talked about it, and can CK go at the beginning of a word?
No, it can't.
And best of all, Noah comes out feeling great about what he learned.
All right. So Noah feels obviously better. I know we're low on time, so I'm gonna give you just a moment to process this individually, and just kind of think through, what data did she collect during this lesson, and what feedback was she able to provide Noah? What do you think she was considering in terms of the content that they were working on, this specific student, the context that they were working in, that kind of helped her make decisions when choosing how to support that learner? So we're going to give like just a couple seconds really for some reflection, and then we'll move into some closing, because I know we're close to the end of our time. Okay, so in your handout, there's a link to another video. This focuses on comprehension. So if you'd like to extend your learning a little bit, Or Melissa, this would be helpful, I think, especially for secondary supports, thinking through how data collection might look in comprehension work. So that can be helpful to watch that video and kind of think through the same pieces. With that, though, we're going to move into our next steps and thinking about how you can apply this learning after today. So in your handout as well, we have some additional resources to extend your learning. And then I'm going to pass it to Emily again to close us out with some just recommended next steps for things that you can do after today.
Awesome.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
Yeah. So here is some recommended next steps. So thinking about kind of next steps for us if you're in the classroom, looking at upcoming lessons, or looking at recent work from students and thinking about applying those student work analysis, or for those of us working at a district or county level, how might we support kind of the folks in our systems with taking these next steps as we apply these tools and share them. And then in closing, just a couple of housekeeping items from us. There is a link to a survey that we would love your feedback from the content shared from Ruthie today, and the tools and resources and how this might feed into the work that you are doing. And so we'd really appreciate any feedback you can provide there. And then just a final word of thank you. Thank you for joining today. A thank you to Ruthie for sharing her insight and expertise from TNTP with us. And a thank you to you all for carving out some time on your Monday to do some learning. There are places there that you can follow along some of the resources and materials, as well as I'll always point you back to California Educators Together as kind of the warehouse of all things Project Arise. So thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us. If you have any questions, feel free to stay on. Otherwise, enjoy your evening.